Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1: The Call in the Night. Detective Adrian Cole had seen his share of horrors. He had chased killers down dark alleys, pieced together shattered lives, and sat across from more monsters in human skin than he cared to count. But when his phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m., pulling him from a fitful sleep, the voice on the other end wasn't a call to duty. It was a whisper from a nightmare. "Detective Cole." The voice trembled. "He's taken another one." Adrian didn't need to ask who he was. The Hollow Point Kidnapper, the media's grotesque nickname for a shadowy figure who had stolen 3 children in the past 2 months, leaving nothing behind but empty bedrooms and faint whispers of a man in the dark. The details were always the same: no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Just a child's last breath hanging in the air like a warning. The new victim was a 7-year-old boy named Ethan Dreyer. His mother had found his bed empty when she went to wake him for school. Adrian arrived at the Dryers' modest suburban home just before sunrise, the orange hues of dawn clashing cruelly against the despair etched into Mrs. Dryer's face. Inside Ethan's room, Adrian noted the usual signs: an unmade bed, toys scattered haphazardly, and the boy's shoes neatly placed by the door. But something was off this time. On the nightstand was a single balloon, deflated, its red surface streaked with grime. Adrian slipped on a glove, his pulse quickening as he picked it up. The latex smelled faintly of dirt, and its nozzle was tied with a thin black thread. As Adrian examined the balloon, a movement outside the window caught his eye, a flash of color that disappeared into the woods behind the house. He bolted out, the crisp air biting his face as he scanned the tree line. There was nothing but silence, heavy and waiting. Adrian's phone buzzed again, startling him. The text message was from an unknown number. 4 words glared back at him like a ghostly taunt. "Catch me if you can." Part 2: The Trail in the Woods. Adrian stood at the edge of the woods, the phone's dim glow fading against the stark morning light. His heart pounded in time with his pulse, each beat urging him to plunge into the trees. He pocketed the phone, his eyes narrowing at the faint path where undergrowth had been trampled. The forest was alive with whispers, the creak of branches swaying in the wind, the distant rustle of unseen animals. Every sound felt like a taunt, mocking his attempts to keep calm. He drew his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as he stepped onto the path. His boots crunched over dead leaves and snapped twigs, each sound amplified in the stillness. Adrian knew better than to expect immediate answers. He wasn't chasing a man. He was chasing a ghost, a figure who slipped through security cameras, left no fingerprints, and moved like smoke. But ghosts didn't leave footprints, and there they were, faint impressions in the damp soil, leading deeper into the woods. 20 minutes in, the tracks veered sharply, leading him to a small clearing. At its center stood a solitary structure, a dilapidated wooden shack with warped planks and a sagging roof. The air here felt heavier, the light dimmer, as if the forest itself recoiled from this place. Adrian approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. The shack's door hung ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. He nudged it open with his flashlight, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the smell of mildew mixed with something fouler, rot, perhaps, or decay. The beam of light swept over the interior. Dust motes danced in the air, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper and broken glass. In the far corner sat a child's chair, its wooden frame painted a garish red. A tattered stuffed animal, a rabbit missing one ear, was propped on the seat. Next to it lay a piece of paper folded into quarters. Adrian crouched, his gloved hand trembling as he unfolded the paper. Scrawled in uneven, childlike handwriting was a single question. "Do you know what he sees?" A sound from behind, barely a whisper, the crunch of leaves underfoot, snapped him to attention. He spun, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. But the doorway was empty, the forest silent. Adrian's breaths came short and fast, the notes still clenched in his hand. Whoever was playing this game wasn't done. And Adrian wasn't sure he wanted to know the rules. Part 3: The Cold Files. Adrian didn't sleep that night. Back at the station, he sat in the glow of a desk lamp, its light casting long shadows across the stacks of folders before him. Each one bore the name of a child who had vanished, victims of the Hollow Point Kidnapper. The shack had yielded no immediate answers, but the note's cryptic question gnawed at him. "Do you know what he sees?" He flipped open the first file. Emily Novak, age 6. Taken from her bedroom 3 weeks ago. Her parents had awoken to find her window ajar and her favorite doll left on the sill, its face smeared with mud. No ransom note. No demands. Just silence. Next came Tyler Briggs, age 9. Abducted 2 weeks before Emily. Tyler's case had been different. The boy had been playing in his backyard when he disappeared. His mother found his soccer ball deflated in the middle of the lawn, a thin black thread wrapped around it like a noose. Adrian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The kidnapper left traces, yes, but nothing useful. No DNA. No clear motive. Only a grim collection of trophies that hinted at some twisted purpose. He pulled the latest file, Ethan Dreyer, age 7. The boy's balloon sat on Adrian's desk, now sealed in an evidence bag. He studied the photographs of Ethan's room, pausing on the image of the window. It hadn't been forced open. It had been unlocked. Adrian froze, his mind racing. Emily's window had been unlocked, too. He flipped through the Briggs file. Tyler's backyard gate, left open but unbroken. This wasn't just someone picking locks or slipping through gaps in security. This was someone walking in, as if invited. A knock at the door startled him. Officer Martinez stepped in, her expression grim. "Detective," she said, holding out a sealed envelope. "This just arrived. No return address." Adrian opened it carefully, his breath hitching as he unfolded the contents. Inside was a single photograph, Ethan Dreyer, eyes wide with terror, standing in the shack Adrian had found earlier that day. The red chair was behind him, empty now. The note's cryptic question, "Do you know what he sees?" was written across the bottom of the photo in black marker. Adrian's phone buzzed. A message from the same unknown number as before. "He watches. You'll understand soon." Part 4. A shadow in the crowd. The photo haunted Adrian as he drove through the pre-dawn streets, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Ethan's terrified face was etched into his mind, a reminder that every moment wasted was a moment closer to a tragedy he couldn't afford. The shack had been a dead end, thoroughly searched, no sign of the boy, but the photograph told him it hadn't been a coincidence. Whoever had taken Ethan was watching Adrian closely, guiding him like a piece on a board. By 6 a.m., the streets began to stir. Adrian parked outside a nondescript diner downtown, a favorite among his contacts for its strong coffee and discreet booths. He slid into a corner seat, ordering black coffee before spreading out his notes on the table. The note from the shack, the photograph, and the mysterious text all stared back at him like taunts. "Rough morning?" a voice asked. Adrian looked up. Lydia Cross, a local journalist with an uncanny knack for unearthing stories the department wanted buried, stood beside his table. She had a notebook in one hand and a wary smile on her face. "I don't have time for questions," Adrian muttered, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm not here for quotes," Lydia said, slipping into the seat across from him. "Word's already out about the Dreyer kid. 4th one in 2 months. People are scared. They've got a right to be." Adrian sighed. "Then let me do my job." "I will," she said, leaning forward. "But you might want to hear this first. There's a pattern." He frowned, motioning for her to continue. "I've been digging into these cases. The Novak girl, the Briggs boy, and now Dreyer, they're all connected to someone. A man named Ezra Kane." Adrian's stomach dropped. The name was familiar, a convicted pedophile released from prison 6 months ago after serving 15 years for kidnapping and assault. Kane had disappeared off the radar, but Adrian hadn't forgotten him. "You're telling me Kane's back in town?" he asked. "I'm telling you the kids he's taken are all from families he knew before he went to prison," Lydia said, her voice low. "Neighbors, friends, even family friends. Dryer's father used to do maintenance work for Kane's mother years ago. It's too much to be a coincidence. Adrian's phone buzzed again, interrupting their conversation. Another message from the unknown number. He's closer than you think. Adrian's pulse quickened. He scanned the diner, his eyes darting from table to table. Outside, a figure in a dark hoodie stood across the street, staring directly at him. The figure turned and vanished into the crowd before Adrian could react. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "Stay here," he told Lydia, already moving for the door. The sidewalk was crowded with early commuters, the cold air heavy with exhaust and muffled conversations. Adrian searched the faces around him, his gaze locking onto a flicker of movement down an alley. He gave chase, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The alley was empty when he reached it. Only the faint smell of cigarettes lingered, along with a crumpled piece of paper near a dumpster. Adrian picked it up, his stomach nodding as he read the words scrawled across it. "The game has begun. Part 5, The Forgotten Ward." The paper trembled in Adrian's hand as he reread the message. The game has begun. The alley seemed to close in around him, its shadowed corners concealing things that didn't want to be found. He pocketed the note, scanning the area one last time before heading back to the diner. Lydia was gone, leaving only a coffee-stained napkin with a hurried scrawl. "Be careful. Call me if you need anything." Adrian crushed it in his fist. Kane's name hung in his thoughts like a shadow, every detail of the man's vow coming back to him with chilling clarity. Kane had been methodical, manipulative, and cruel. But he never worked alone. Adrian returned to the precinct, pushing past the morning chaos to his desk. He pulled up Kane's file, poring over the names and connections tied to the man's past crimes. One stood out, Robert Finch, a former associate who had turned state's witness to avoid a life sentence. Finch had disappeared after Kane's trial, slipping into the kind of anonymity only fear could buy. Adrian's search for Finch led him to a crumbling tenement on the edge of town, a place locals called the Forgotten Ward. The building stood like a decayed tooth in a mouth of neglect, its windows cracked and its walls streaked with grime. The landlord didn't even bother with pretense. He took Adrian's badge as permission to talk. "Yeah, Finch lived here," the man said, his breath reeking of stale cigarettes. "But he moved out last week. Didn't say where. Didn't seem like he wanted to be found." Adrian felt the faint burn of frustration. "Did he leave anything behind?" The landlord shrugged, pulling a ring of keys from his pocket. "Couple things. Room 307. Do what you need to do." The hallway leading to Finch's room smelled of damp and despair. Adrian unlocked the door, stepping into a cramped space littered with empty beer bottles and fast food wrappers. On a rickety desk sat a Polaroid camera and a stack of photographs. Adrian flipped through them, his breath catching as he recognized the faces of the missing children. Emily Novak, Tyler Briggs, Ethan Dyer. All photographed in the same red chair he had seen in the shack. The last photo stopped him cold, Ethan, but not the Ethan from the photographs sent to him earlier. This Ethan looked blank, his eyes glassy, his body slumped. Pinned beneath the last photograph was a sticky note in the same crude, childlike handwriting as the note found at the shack. "Do you see now?" A faint creak from the hallway snapped Adrian to attention. He drew his gun, moving to the door in 2 silent steps. Peering through the crack, he caught a glimpse of someone disappearing down the stairwell. The thud of hurried footsteps echoed faintly. Adrian gave chase, bursting into the stairwell and vaulting down the steps. He hit the street just in time to see the figure vanish into an alley. Sprinting after them, he rounded the corner and froze. The alley was empty, save for a single Polaroid pinned to the wall with a knife. Adrian pulled it free, the edges of the photo sticky with fresh blood. It was another image of Ethan, this time in a different location. Behind him was a wall covered in graffiti, a grotesque face painted in dripping red. A chill ran through Adrian as he recognized the location. It was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, a place long rumored to hide more than just vagrants. Part 6, The Factory's Echo. The factory loomed like a carcass of steel and stone, its jagged edges silhouetted against the bruised sky. Adrian stood at the rusted chain-link gate, his breath fogging in the cold air. A single crow cawed from a broken window, its sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung over the place. The Polaroid was clutched in his hand, Ethan's vacant stare burning into his mind. Pushing through the gate, Adrian followed a cracked concrete path choked with weeds and broken glass. The factory's main entrance yawned open, its heavy doors pried apart years ago by time or trespassers. He stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal a cavernous space littered with debris. The air was thick with the smell of oil, rust, and something fouler, something organic and wrong. The graffiti from the Polaroid stretched across a far wall, the grotesque red face leering at him like a warning. Adrian's footsteps echoed against the steel beams as he moved closer, scanning for anything that might lead him to Ethan. Near the base of the wall, he found a trail of small, muddy footprints leading toward a stairwell descending into darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows. He tightened his grip on it, forcing his feet to move. Each step down the stairwell seemed louder than the last, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence below. When he reached the bottom, the flashlight's beam revealed a long corridor lined with broken machinery. The smell of rot was stronger here, clinging to the back of his throat. Halfway down the corridor, Adrian froze. A low, mechanical hum reverberated through the walls. He strained to locate its source, turning his flashlight toward a metal door at the end of the hall. The hum grew louder as he approached, joined now by a faint, irregular tapping, like a child's fingers drumming against a wooden table. The door was ajar. Adrian pushed it open slowly, his gun raised, the creak of the hinges cutting through the low hum. The room beyond was a nightmare. The red chair sat in the center, illuminated by a single overhead bulb that swayed on its cord. A camera on a tripod faced the chair, its lens cracked but still operational. Scattered across the floor were photographs, hundreds of them, each one capturing a child in that chair, Emily, Tyler, Ethan, and others he didn't recognize. Adrian's breath caught as he spotted Ethan slumped in the chair, his small body barely stirring. He rushed forward, kneeling beside the boy and feeling for a pulse. It was weak but there, his skin cold and clammy. A groggy mumble escaped Ethan's lips as his eyelids fluttered. "Ethan," Adrian whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've got you. You're safe now." Before he could move the boy, the hum intensified. Adrian turned just in time to see the camera's lens shift, angling toward him with an almost sentient precision. He heard a faint click, then a series of rapid, mechanical flashes. The photographs on the floor began to flutter as if caught in an invisible wind. Behind him, Ethan let out a low, guttural moan. Adrian spun back to see the boy's eyes snap open, his pupils blown wide as his lips formed silent words. Adrian leaned closer, barely able to hear Ethan's whisper over the rising hum. "He sees you," the boy rasped, his voice distorted, otherworldly. "He's watching." The bulb overhead flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. The hum stopped, leaving only the sound of Adrian's ragged breathing. And then, from somewhere deeper in the factory, a voice broke the silence, a low, sing-song melody that chilled Adrian to his core. "Do you see what I see?" Part 7, Cat and Mouse. The voice echoed in the dark, a sing-song mockery that made Adrian's blood run cold. He tightened his grip on Ethan, hoisting the boy into his arms. The flashlight's beam trembled as it swept the room, revealing only the scattered photographs and the eerily motionless red chair. Somewhere in the factory, the voice sang again, faint and taunting. "Do you see what I see?" Adrian swallowed his fear, his voice low and firm. "I see you, you bastard. You're not walking away from this." He backed out of the room, keeping the flashlight trained on the doorway. The corridor stretched before him like an open throat, its shadows deep and menacing. Every creak of the factory seemed amplified, each sound threatening to betray his position. Ethan stirred in his arms, his breathing shallow. Adrian glanced down. "Hang in there, kid. I'll get you out." A sudden crash erupted behind him. He spun, the flashlight catching the glint of broken glass spilling from a high window. Nothing moved in the dark, but the air felt charged, alive with unseen eyes. Adrian turned back toward the stairwell, moving quickly but carefully, his boots crunching over debris. He reached the stairs and started to climb, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. Halfway up, the flashlight flickered, its beam dimming to an anemic glow. Adrian cursed under his breath, shaking it violently until the light steadied. When he reached the top, the factory floor stretched before him, its emptiness vast and oppressive. The exit was in sight, a faint rectangle of moonlight spilling through the open doors. Adrian broke into a run, each step heavy with Ethan's weight. The boy whimpered softly, his head lolling against Adrian's chest. Almost there, Adrian panted. Stay with me. As he neared the exit, a figure stepped into view, blocking the way. Adrian's heart stopped. The man was tall and thin, his face obscured by a crude mask fashioned from a burlap sack. Dark stains spread across the fabric, their origin grimly obvious. In his hand he held a knife that glinted dully in the moonlight. Adrian stopped, shifting Ethan's weight to one arm as he drew his gun. Don't move, he barked. Drop the knife and get on the ground. The figure tilted his head, the gesture slow and deliberate. Then he raised the knife, the blade catching the light as he pointed it toward Adrian. A guttural laugh escaped the mask, a sound that sent a shiver down Adrian's spine. Do you see him now? The man hissed, his voice a rasping growl. Adrian didn't wait. He fired, the gunshot roaring through the empty factory. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder as the knife clattered to the ground. Adrian bolted past him, not waiting to see if he'd stay down. The cold night air hit him like a slap as he burst through the doors, his legs pumping as he ran toward his car. The factory behind him seemed to groan in protest, its shadows writhing with unseen movement. Adrian reached the car and threw the back door open, laying Ethan gently across the seat. The boy murmured something unintelligible, his eyes fluttering closed. You're okay, Adrian whispered, his voice shaking. You're okay. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. As he sped away, the factory grew smaller in the rearview mirror. But just before it disappeared from view, he saw it, a silhouette standing in the doorway, watching him leave. And in his lap, the Polaroid camera lay untouched, but a fresh photograph had appeared on the passenger seat. Adrian picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of himself, taken from somewhere inside the factory. The note scrawled across the bottom read, You're next. Part 8, the voice on the tape. Adrian's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the car tore through the city's sleeping streets. Ethan lay pale and trembling in the back seat, his breath shallow but steady. Adrian's mind raced with the fresh threat in his lap, the Polaroid, still slick with chemicals, its warning stark and impossible to ignore. You're next. He arrived at the hospital in record time. Paramedics whisked Ethan away, but Adrian stayed only long enough to confirm the boy was in stable hands. The scene at the factory churned in his thoughts. Who was the masked man? Was he the Hollow Point Kidnapper, or just another player in this nightmarish game? Adrian returned to the station, slumping into his chair under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Polaroid sat on his desk like a coiled serpent, daring him to unravel its mystery. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and called Officer Martinez. Martinez? Her voice crackled through the line. You look like hell. Feel worse, Adrian replied. I need someone to check the factory. I left in a hurry. There's evidence. And a guy in a burlap mask. Be careful. You're not making me feel better about this, she said, but Adrian heard the determination in her voice. I'll call you when I know something. He hung up and turned his attention to the Polaroid camera he had taken from Finch's apartment. It sat on the desk, old and battered, but functional. A strange urge took hold of him. He picked it up, pointed it at the room, and pressed the shutter. The whir of the film ejecting filled the silence. The picture developed slowly, the faint image emerging like a ghost. Adrian frowned. The photo didn't show the room. It showed the factory, the red chair, the camera, the photographs scattered on the floor. But the chair wasn't empty. A shadowy figure sat in it, its head bowed, its face hidden. Adrian's skin crawled. He pulled the photo closer, squinting at the figure. Was it the masked man? Or something else entirely? A faint knock broke his trance. He looked up to see Lydia Cross standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "I heard about the boy," she said, stepping inside. "And about the factory." "Not your story, Cross," Adrian muttered. "Go home." She ignored him, pulling a small recorder from her bag and placing it on the desk. "You need to hear this. I went digging after our conversation. A contact of mine had something on Ezra Kane. You're not going to like it." Adrian hesitated before hitting play. The tape hissed for a moment, then a voice crackled to life. It was deep, raspy, and disturbingly calm. "Do you see them?" the voice asked. "The children, their eyes wide, their mouths silent? They are watching. They are always watching." Adrian's blood turned to ice as the voice continued, each word burrowing into his mind. "I take them to him, to the one who sees. He waits in the dark, and I am his hands. Soon, detective, you will see. You will understand. He is coming for you." The recording ended with a burst of static. Lydia's face was grim. "The contact said this was recorded 2 days ago, outside Kane's last known hideout." Adrian stared at the recorder, the Polaroid in his hand trembling. The photo, the note, the tape, it all pointed to something bigger, something darker than he'd imagined. And whoever he was, Adrian had no doubt he was being hunted. Part 9. The Eyes in the Shadows. The tape's final crackle lingered in Adrian's ears like a warning he couldn't unhear. He sat motionless, the Polaroid and recorder in front of him, Lydia's concerned gaze heavy on him. The words repeated in his head, each one etching deeper into his thoughts. "He is coming for you. Your contact," Adrian said finally, his voice low. "Where is Kane?" Lydia shook her head. "He doesn't know. Kane disappeared weeks ago, but this isn't just him anymore, is it? Whoever's pulling the strings, it's bigger than we thought." Adrian nodded grimly, his mind racing. "The factory. Something about that place isn't right. I need to go back." "You're insane," Lydia said, her voice rising. "You barely made it out the first time. You should let the others handle this." "I can't," Adrian snapped, standing abruptly. "This isn't a job for someone else. It's on me now." She opened her mouth to argue, but the steel in Adrian's eyes silenced her. With a reluctant sigh, she handed him her phone. "Take this. I have a GPS tracker on it. If you vanish, I'm coming after you." Adrian gave her a nod of thanks and left, his footsteps echoing through the empty precinct. The city outside was a patchwork of shadows and streetlights, the world unnervingly quiet as he drove back to the factory. The building loomed larger in the darkness, its skeletal frame illuminated faintly by the moon. Adrian parked a distance away and approached on foot, his gun drawn and flashlight steady. The air felt heavier here, the silence unnaturally deep. The main entrance was still open, a dark maw inviting him in. Adrian hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he pushed forward, stepping into the cavernous space once more. The red graffiti on the far wall seemed brighter now, the grotesque face almost alive in the pale light filtering through broken windows. Adrian's flashlight swept across the room, revealing nothing but debris. Yet the sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He moved toward the stairwell, but this time, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of movement near the far wall. Adrian swung the flashlight around, the beam landing on a pair of eyes staring back at him from the shadows. They were impossibly wide, unblinking, and glowing faintly in the dark. Adrian froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stepped forward, a boy, no older than 10, wearing a tattered shirt and jeans. His face was pale, his expression blank, his movements unnaturally stiff. "Kid," Adrian called softly, lowering his gun. Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. He simply pointed a trembling finger toward the stairwell Adrian had descended earlier. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Did he take you? Adrian pressed, stepping closer. Do you know where he is? The boy's arm fell limply to his side, and he turned away, walking into the shadows without a sound. Adrian's flashlight followed, but the boy disappeared as if swallowed by the darkness. Adrian's pulse raced as he reached the stairwell and descended again. The corridor below was just as he'd left it, the air still thick with rot and decay. But something had changed. The door to the room with the red chair was now closed, though he had left it open. Faint whispers leaked from behind it, like the rustle of dry leaves. Adrian approached slowly, every nerve on edge. He pushed the door open, and his flashlight flickered violently as if the air itself resisted the intrusion. The room was empty. The red chair sat in the center, the camera gone. But the walls, oh God, the walls, were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned in neat rows, their subjects wide-eyed and staring. Adrian's heart sank as he recognized every face. The missing children. And in the center of it all, a single photograph larger than the rest. It showed Adrian himself, standing at the factory's entrance. Beneath it, written in blood-red ink, "He sees you now." Part 10, The Whispering Maze. Adrian's breath hitched as he stared at the photograph, his own image caught mid-stride at the factory's entrance. It was impossible. The shot was taken only minutes ago, yet he hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard the telltale click of a camera. His flashlight trembled, casting shadows that danced like mocking specters across the walls of missing children. The whispers began again, faint but insistent, coming from deeper within the factory. Adrian turned, his gun raised, the light following the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a chorus of soft, murmuring voices overlapping in a dissonant symphony. He strained to make out the words but caught only fragments. See him, don't look away, always watching. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out before the factory swallowed him whole. But he thought of Ethan, his small, pale face drained of life, whispering, "He sees you." If Adrian left now, it wouldn't stop. The nightmare would find another child, another victim. He had to end it. Following the whispers, Adrian left the room. The corridor stretched ahead, longer than he remembered, as if the walls had shifted while he was inside. His boots scraped against the concrete, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. The smell of rot grew stronger, mingling with something metallic, like blood. The whispers grew louder as he moved deeper into the factory. They became clearer now, more purposeful, as if guiding him. Come closer, he's waiting, so close now. Adrian rounded a corner and stopped. The corridor split into 3 paths, each one identical and stretching into the dark. The whispers seemed to come from all of them, rising and falling like the ebb of a tide. He shone his flashlight down each passage, but they revealed nothing. No doors, no markings. Just endless, yawning blackness. He cursed under his breath. "You're not scaring me off," he growled into the silence. He picked the leftmost path and moved cautiously forward. The walls here were narrower, the air heavier. Every step echoed strangely, as though the sound bent and warped before reaching his ears. The whispers quieted, replaced by a faint sound, like breathing. Adrian stopped, his flashlight scanning the walls. That's when he saw it, a smear of red leading to a door barely visible at the end of the corridor. He approached, his heart pounding, and nudged the door open with his foot. It groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a small, windowless room. In the center stood a mannequin, its pale, featureless face turned toward him. It wore a burlap sack over its head, identical to the one the masked man had worn earlier. The sack was stained with fresh blood, dripping steadily onto the floor. Adrian's stomach churned. Pinned to the mannequin's chest was a photograph of another child. This one Adrian didn't recognize, a boy about 8 years old, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Beneath the photo was a note, scrawled in the same crude handwriting. "You're running out of time." A sudden sound behind him, a sharp, metallic clang. Adrian whirled, gun raised, but the corridor was empty. The door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder now, pressing against his skull. "See him, don't look away." Adrian turned back to the mannequin, but it had moved. Its head was now tilted to one side, as if it were watching him. The burlap sack twitched, and Adrian's blood froze. It was breathing. Part 11. The Man Behind the Mask. Adrian's finger tightened on the trigger as the mannequin's burlap-covered head jerked faintly, the sound of labored breathing emanating from beneath it. The darkness pressed in, his flashlight flickering like a sputtering candle. He aimed the beam at the figure, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing back at him in fragments. The breathing stopped. Adrian took a step closer, sweat slicking his palms despite the icy chill in the air. He kicked at the mannequin's base, and it toppled with a heavy thud. The burlap sack came loose, revealing nothing beneath it but cold, lifeless plastic. He let out a shaky breath, his muscles loosening slightly. The relief was short-lived. From the far corner of the room came a sound, a low, guttural chuckle, deep and resonant. Adrian swung his flashlight, its beam catching a silhouette shifting in the shadows. "I see you've found my messenger," the figure rasped, its voice a gravelly blend of amusement and menace. Adrian's blood ran cold. "Show yourself," he barked, stepping toward the corner. His gun was steady, but his heart pounded in his ears. The figure moved forward, stepping into the light. It was the man from the factory entrance, the burlap-masked figure Adrian had shot earlier. Blood seeped through the crude sack, staining his shirt, but he stood tall and unwavering, the glint of something sharp catching in his hand. "You've been quite persistent," the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Most would have run by now. But not you." Adrian didn't lower his gun. "Take off the mask," he ordered. "Now." The man tilted his head, his laugh a dry, rattling sound. "You think seeing my face will change anything? You've already seen enough. You've already been marked. I'll put you down if you don't comply," Adrian warned, taking aim at the man's chest. The man raised his knife, the light catching its jagged edge. "Do you know why they look at you like that, detective? The children in the photos?" He took a step closer. "Because they see what's coming. They see him." Adrian's breath caught. "Who's him? What are you talking about?" The man's head tilted further, an unnatural angle that made Adrian's stomach turn. "He's always watching. He's always waiting. And now so are you." The knife came up, but Adrian didn't give him a chance. He fired, the shot shattering the oppressive silence. The man staggered, collapsing to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Adrian kept his gun trained, stepping closer cautiously. He nudged the body with his foot, but the man didn't move. For a moment, all was still. Then the whispers returned. Adrian spun, his flashlight darting across the room, but the source of the sound eluded him. The whispers grew louder, rising to an almost deafening pitch, as if the walls themselves were alive with voices. He turned back to the body, only to find it gone. In its place lay another photograph, freshly developed, the ink still wet. Adrian's stomach churned as he picked it up. The photo showed him standing in the very room he was in, gun raised, staring at the mannequin. But in the shadows behind him was something else. A tall, thin figure loomed, its face an unnatural blur of teeth and hollow eyes. Beneath the image were the words, "He's here." The room plunged into total darkness, the flashlight flickering one last time before dying. Adrian's breath hitched as he felt it, the air shifting, the presence of something immense, watching, waiting, approaching. And then the voice, low and guttural, so close it seemed to come from inside his own head. "Do you see me now?" Part 12. Into the Hollow. Adrian froze, the voice reverberating through his skull, its words heavy and dripping with malice. "Do you see me now?" The darkness was absolute, suffocating, alive with the whispers that clawed at his sanity. He steadied his breath, his hand gripping the flashlight's useless shell like a lifeline. The air shifted again, colder now, carrying the faint stench of decay. Adrian's instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. He raised his gun blindly, the room swallowing any sound save the soft scrape of something moving toward him. "You won't win," Adrian said, his voice trembling but defiant. "You don't scare me." The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Then, a flicker, a dim, unnatural light glowing faintly ahead. It wasn't the stark beam of his flashlight or the pale glow of moonlight, but something cold, spectral, casting twisted shadows that writhed against the walls. Adrian moved toward it, each step a battle against the primal fear clawing at his chest. The glow led him out of the room, through a maze of twisting hallways that seemed to shift with every turn. The factory was different now, a grotesque distortion of the space he had entered. Pipes jutted from the walls at unnatural angles, their metallic groans echoing like dying breaths. The smell of blood and rot thickened. Ahead, the light grew brighter, revealing a massive chamber Adrian didn't remember from his earlier search. At its center stood the red chair, now surrounded by a crude circle of candles. The wax had dripped down their sides like veins, pooling in viscous puddles. Photographs lined the walls, their subjects' hollow eyes seeming to follow Adrian as he approached. In the chair sat a figure. Not a mannequin this time, but something real, its body gaunt, its skin stretched tight over a frame too tall and too thin to be human. Its head was turned downward, a burlap sack obscuring its face. Adrian raised his gun, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "What do you want?" The figure moved, its head lifting slowly. The burlap sack slid away, revealing a face that was a nightmare of teeth and darkness. Hollow, hungry eyes locked onto Adrian, and a smile spread across its impossibly wide mouth. "You!" it rasped. Its voice was the culmination of every whisper, every taunt, every nightmare that had plagued Adrian since the case began. The lights around the room flared, illuminating the photographs. Adrian's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. Every image, every child, every victim, they weren't looking at their abductor. They were looking at this. Adrian fired, the shot tearing through the creature's chest. It didn't flinch. It rose from the chair, its limbs unfolding in grotesque angles, the smile never fading. The whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out Adrian's panicked thoughts. He fired again. And again. Each bullet disappeared into the creature's form, swallowed by the void of its presence. The gun clicked empty, useless against the impossible. The creature stepped closer, its elongated fingers reaching for Adrian. "You've seen me now," it growled. "You cannot unsee. You are mine." Adrian stumbled back, his hands scrambling for anything, a weapon, a way out. His fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. The Polaroid camera. He lifted it instinctively, snapping a picture. The flash exploded, brighter than any light Adrian had ever seen. The creature recoiled, its form shuddering and distorting. The light seemed to tear through it, ripping apart the shadows that composed its body. The whispers turned to screams, and the factory walls trembled as if alive. Adrian didn't wait to see the outcome. He turned and ran, the floor shaking beneath his feet, the air thick with the sound of collapsing steel. He burst into the night, gulping in the cold air as the factory behind him groaned and crumbled. When he finally stopped, miles away, he looked down at the Polaroid clutched in his hand. The image had developed, a blurry, white void where the creature had been. Beneath it, scrawled in blood-red ink, was a final message. "Not gone. Just waiting." Epilogue. Adrian sat alone in his apartment, the city's lights twinkling beyond the window. The case was closed, the children were laid to rest. Yet, the whispers remained. In the silence of the night, he felt it watching. Always watching. Because some things, once seen, never leave.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.